One of the most important lessons that writers first need to learn and then relearn at every level of their advancement is how to cut. Because I know countless authors when they are beginners who see that they have a lot of fluff, a lot of useless content. But as they start to increase their skills, their ego, their shield, their lust to project their story on the page without any consideration of the reader gets in the way of how great their story could be. And Kurt Vonnegut said that, quote, "It may be you too are capable of making necklaces for Cleopatra, so to speak, but your eloquence should be the servant of the ideas in your head. Your rule might be this: if a sentence, no matter how excellent, does not illuminate your subject in some new and useful way, scratch it out." And when I talk about some of the greatest writers of all time behind me, who spent thousands of hours, anywhere from 3 to 10,000 hours on all of their novels, it only takes them a couple hundred hours to get the first draft down. So what did they do in the remaining 5,000 hours? What they do is go over their work sentence by sentence and make cuts and do countless rewrites until not just every sentence, but every word matters. And I understand that in 2025, once again, because of our ego, because of our lust to be the writer, we can't do that. Our ADHD, our problems, our responsibilities, our addiction to digital technology makes us think that we don't need to do that because it's much easier that way. It's much easier to say that there are no readers left in the world, even though we are more literate than ever as a collective, and not actually have to work hard than it is to acknowledge that these writers in the past worked way harder than we did. They had better strategies, they had better upbringings, they had a better education, and a better mentality when it came to writing. And learning to cut, especially if you are on an island, especially if you do not have readers who love your work, is somewhat of an impossible task because many of the advanced writers I know who struggle with this fall into two different categories. The first one being the overly intellectual types who are talented readers, writers, and thinkers. And as they progress over years and over thousands of hours, their powers keep increasing. And because they feel like they are getting better at writing, because they are, and they know more about the world, they feel like they have to put that on the page. But unfortunately, there is a limit to comprehension. This is something that I learned the hard way. This is something my writing program did teach me, that at some point I was just writing like crazy. And I just kept increasing the technical ability and the complexity of my work. And they were in line with one could call the logic of the story. Like, it wasn't confusing. But I had my professor tell me, who was young, who was ambitious, who did read your stuff, who has now been published multiple times by major houses, that he said, "Ian, I got home today after being at work and doing my own writing, and I sat down and I poured a glass of whiskey and was enjoying myself, listening to some music, and I started to read your work, and it jolted me awake. It forced me to actually read it, and it was too much." And that may sound harsh, but this is a guy who is a spectacular reader. But we are all human. Most of us don't do our reading with a full tank of energy because we don't have a job or a wife or kids, and we wake up and we have a cup of coffee and we sit down and we read for 5 hours. That's not our reality, at least a lot of the time. I used to have that reality when I was younger and in university. I used to just read, and I could read whatever, and I was on this ever-increasing train of complexity. And there are some readers out there like that, but 90% of people aren't going to appreciate overt complexity. And this is why, for instance, authors like David Foster Wallace over there, sorry, you can't see the book, An Infinite Jest behind me, would have sections that were very dense and complex and where he was flexing and going crazy. And then you would pair that or contrast it with very easy sections that read like a typical novel. Other authors, like Cormac McCarthy, instead of making his novels more complex, which he could have, decided to hide an occult information to get so good at symbolism and layering that those who could see it could understand it, and those who couldn't would be unconsciously programmed by it. And those are really the only two ways out. But I know countless people who don't have the reader in mind. When you make art for art's sake, what you are doing is just navel gazing. Because at some point, and I'm being honest here, with the novel, with visual arts and other things, and movies even, maybe not movies, but with many other art forms, you can go pretty crazy and get ever more complex. And because it's a passive listening or watching experience, like I can watch a movie, and even if it's the most complex one ever, I can still just kind of take it in and be entertained. Same with music. If I'm listening to Mahavishnu Orchestra or some other experimental band trying to push the limits, then it can be a jumble on my brain and be annoying, but it's not the end of the world. I can still experience it. But with a novel, to actually experience it means that you have to dedicate the time and the mental energy to finish it and to get it, which the harder it is, the slower you have to read. And so many of you guys are at the point where if you just flexed on the page and went all out, you'd be above everybody's head, even above my head. And so the real art of writing is learning to cut, learning to contrast and weave in harder sections with easier sections, or motivating someone with easier sections, or with a really great story to tackle a hard section in the middle of the novel. I've seen plenty of novels do that. Or you learn to occult information. And so I want you guys to grapple with that for a second. Next, there is a different type of writer who are emotional, who are oversharers, who are speaking from the heart. And there are ever expansive worlds in that realm too. And these writers are very good at poetry, and this can be very good if it's limited to 30 lines. But if you bring too much heart to the page, too much love or emotion, too much aesthetic, you run into the same trap. It may not be complex, but I can only handle so much purple language or so much flowery language or style before it becomes too much. I can only handle so much sentimentality and love or hate or some of these things. And what's interesting is that writers who are isolated and independent, most of the time, like right now, if you're thinking of yourself and you're like, hey, I don't have any readers. And if you don't have any readers, I have a solution for you. Down in the description below, I have 2 different free resources. I just launched a second channel titled The Literary Renaissance, where I teach writers how to not just find readers, but kick off a literary renaissance. I also help readers learn how to talk about books to other people. Second, I have a free course that is 3 hours long on how to find people to read your stuff. So right now, within a week, if you just follow some of that free content, you could easily find people to read and comment on your work. It's not hard. But the reason I'm mentioning it is because I've learned, having talked to hundreds of authors on my office hours and some of the events and some of the free calls I did over the past couple of years, that many authors who are isolated, who have no one to read their stuff, who fall into many of these traps, don't have friends, don't have anyone in their personal life to look at their stuff, and they don't have people to put them in check. One of the best ways not to over-intellectualize everything as a man is to date women. It's crazy. You actually have to open up and use emotions and calm down and not be right about every little thing if you want to be successful at that endeavor. One of the best ways to stop oversharing and being too sentimental and too emotional on the page is to know people in real life who are like, dude, what the fuck are you doing? What do you mean? Calm down. You're being crazy right now. And when you are put in check in real life, and then especially when you find people who will do that to your work, which is what you should be seeking out, then it's actually a pretty easy obstacle to overcome. But we have so many isolated authors out there who are literally not in contact with anyone, who have written for years and maybe shown a couple people, but have received no real feedback and have not learned the importance of cutting. They've especially not received feedback from people who know how to read and know what needs to be cut. Because through many of the writing workshops I've done in my free writing group I used to host in Las Vegas, I would, submit a short story or a poem or something, and I would get all these edits, and a lot of the time I didn't agree with them, but I would start to see like, that's interesting. A lot of people said this was dumb. I thought this was really good. But I started to train myself to realize that what I think is important isn't important. And this is why authors get better. It isn't a coincidence that someone like a Cormac McCarthy, who was this isolated individual, wrote his first novel, and it was wild. It was too advanced. But by working with Albert Erskine, who was Faulkner's editor, and I can't remember who else right now, a bit tired, but he edited a ton of famous novelists. And he actually read his work. They sent back hundreds of letters just editing and going over the minutia. Like, this timeline is off. By having someone do that, it does help your novel. And Cormac rejected a lot of the changes that were recommended. But as each novel started to happen, he started to gain strength. By the time he got to Suttree and Blood Meridian, he was writing in conjunction with how he should be writing, with how good writing should go. Because there is a very loose template to how art should be done, but it's not something that I could teach. It's a psychic body that you can embody, not to sound weird, but once you see it, then you can just fill it up with your own variation of things, and then you can make some different changes. But many of us are in artistic scarcity. We have a blindness to that body, and the only way we can do it is through practice and through sharing our work and through seeing and modifying. And learning to cut is one of the biggest deciding factors out there, because I ran a short story contest a couple months ago, the Right Conscious Short Story Contest, and I got like 60 submissions or something crazy. It was wild. Books worth of content that I had to like sit and read. And that was awesome. And what I learned though is that I judged each one, and I tried to read them at least twice or like 1.5 times. Like if they were bad, I would at least read it. And I made comments and, sent comments and positive support back to people, and, some edits and some changes, all for free. And when I looked back like a month or two ago, I looked back at the winners, then I looked back at the people who I rated the lowest. And most of the people at the bottom of the barrel, outside of one person just didn't have any pizzazz to the writing. Like, it was just really flat. And so it was just kind of like, why am I reading this? But everyone else were decent writers, had good ideas, but they had a lot of unnecessary information. There would be paragraphs at a time where I'd be reading about some trailer or, some weird thing, some weird description, some weird rabbit hole that really didn't matter, that connected to nothing. Or I'd be things would be too long. And that's what I realized. I was like, this is the difference, that everyone can write decent sentences. Everyone's got a good idea. But within the framework, because a short story, I think I had like a 5,000 word limit. There's only so much that you can do. And what I think a lot of authors fall into, a trap with the novel is that you write a short story. This is what happened to me. I remember writing these short stories and I felt so limited. And I was like, dude, like I want to write a novel. And so then I wrote a first draft of a novel, and it was so expansive. Then I started working on some other drafts of it. And I was like, wait, there's so much fluff in here. Like, I did 120,000 words. There was probably 60,000 words once I realized what was happening of salvageable content, because feeling like I could expand was actually problematic, because my brain was just dumping stuff that didn't matter. When I was constrained to tell this story that I really felt attached to and I really felt like mattered in 3,000 words, I tried to cut anything I could. I tried to make transitions perfect so I could cut more there and add more symbolism, yada, yada, yada. But when you have 100,000 words, you guys, is a lot, especially to tell a story. And like, a lot of people's stories aren't these like space operas with 45 different characters. It's like, just a typical structure with a couple characters, a couple secondary characters, plot, subplot. 100 to 150,000 words is more than enough to get that done. I've seen authors do it in 50,000 words, and it's a masterpiece. So also keep that in mind, because the thing is that if you have a bunch of beta readers, or if you're getting traffic, like if you follow along with the course I just talked about, and you're getting people to read your stuff and they're not finishing it, they're not liking it, they're not leaving reviews or doing whatever, then that most likely means they aren't finishing it. They aren't enjoying it. And one of the easy hacks to get people into anything is just decrease the length of it. Instead of releasing some 4-hour movie, let's just make it 90 minutes and keep it tighter. And another thing you can do is say, okay, this isn't working. I need to retrain myself at the level I'm at and work on shorter things. Or it's not bad to release a 50,000 word novel. A 50,000 word novel isn't different than a 100,000 word one in terms of you get more prestige points for writing an extra 50,000 words. Because if you can't entertain people over the course of 2,000 or 3,000 words, you can't keep them engaged, then why the hell do you think you can do it at 100,000? And that's what's interesting about Substack. That's what's interesting about being online and going out and getting people to read your stuff and getting honest opinions online or from people, is that if you're not hitting or you're not interesting, then why would you think that you would be able to charge money and do it on a broader scale? And so now I want